Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. So I was thinking about swearing a little bit. I have to be very careful with the video. Sometimes I have to edit out swear words because YouTube doesn't like bad language, and that's probably understandable. And it just got me thinking, and I you know, sometimes I've dropped the odd F-bomb, but never a C-bomb in a video. But I know some people who do. And it got me thinking back to when I was a youngster, to the first time I ever found out that there was a word more forbidden and more rude than the F word. I thought the F word was about as far as you could go. But one day I was playing on a climbing frame. I was about 8 or 9 years old, something like that. And there was a kid a bit rougher than me, I think it's fair to say. And I think he must have said the F word a few times, and perhaps someone said, oh, you shouldn't say that, you're naughty. And he said, well, that's not even the rudest word there is. We said, of course it is, you know, everyone knows that. And he said, no, I know a word that is even more forbidden and even more rude than that. My dad said it, and then I said it. I heard him say it, and then one day I said it. He said, no, you must never say that word. He said, it's worse than the F word. He said, yeah. Well, what is it? So he said, he was reluctant. He looked around, but he wanted to show off. So he turned to me and he said, knut. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Mr. Smelly Fragrance Show. So it's a 10th anniversary special, a celebration of Creed Aventus, 10 years old this month. It was first released in September 2010, 10 years back. And I'm going to talk about this fragrance, my thoughts on the fragrance now that we've had it for 10 years. One of the most talked about fragrances in the fragrance community for men. And I'm also going to talk about some of the alternatives for the fragrance and sum up what I think are some of the best alternative options, including inexpensive clones, of which there are of course many. Also more pricey clones, which claim to use higher quality ingredients and maybe even improve on Aventus in some ways. And also a couple of niche fragrances, which certainly take some cues, I think, from Aventus, although they are not out and out clones. So let's get stuck into it. First of all, a little bit of brief information about the fragrance itself. So it's 10 years back that this one came out. A lot of us sort of take it for granted in the fragrance community because it's been around so long. So a lot of us who got into the hobby, maybe when we first got really interested in fragrances, discovered niche fragrances that are not just your average designer fragrances, some ones that have a little bit more of an exclusive air, made by brands who only really do fragrances. We discovered them through the brand of Creed, and very often, if it was in the last 10 years, it may well have been Aventus that was the first thing you had tried. It's their biggest selling fragrance, the House of Creed, founded in 1760, famous for many other fragrances, including in men's fragrances, Green Irish Tweed from 1985. If you're enjoying the video, and if you haven't already done so, please subscribe by hitting the subscribe button down below. Then you won't miss any of my future videos, and it does help me out a lot too. This one came out in 2010, and it really broke the brand through from being one that maybe people, a small number of in-the-know people, or people into fragrances, or very wealthy people knew about and used, maybe celebrities, to being a brand that many people now in the world at large, average people maybe, aspire to own a fragrance by, and often it's Creed Aventus that they want. So the fragrance had a really interesting story around it when it first came out. Creed actually described the fragrance as being inspired by Napoleon Bonaparte, the ruler of France back at the end of the 18th century and the very beginning of the 19th century. A famous figure, a very successful military man, at least for a time, and it all went wrong in the end, but he invaded a lot of other countries, spread his ideas, and the ideas kind of stemming from the French Revolution around Europe. So not a figure everybody perhaps thinks is 100% a good guy in history, but one that is generally viewed as a reasonably favourable, in some ways admirable historical figure. Interestingly, Creed have now moved away from talking about him so much. I think their blurb now, I saw recently, that they mention Napoleon Bonaparte and Alexander the Great as being people slightly behind inspiring the fragrance. But the blurb when they first came out of it with this was all about Napoleon, and I really like the story. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an excerpt here. It's from a blog called Scented Salamander 10 years ago when the fragrance was about to be released, and he described it this way. Creed will launch a new fragrance for men from September 2010 called Aventus, which was inspired by the personality and history of conquests of Napoleon Bonaparte. It belongs to Creed's tradition of personality-inspired scents. So here's a quote. I presume this is from Creed, but I can't confirm that. It is a new fragrance for men that celebrates virility, power, strength and vision inspired by Napoleon, who crowned himself Emperor of all Europe. A self-made king who waged war, peace and love on terms he set. Creed Aventus gets its name from an ancient word meaning success. The perfume is described as being imperial fresh. The list of notes is meant to be experienced as symbolic landmarks of the life and rise of Napoleon, eschewing the more classic expression, the rise and fall. Ingredients were carefully selected to make the perfume feel meaningful. The composition opens on blackcurrant from Corsica, where Napoleon was born, bergamot from Italy to celebrate his victories there, Calville Blanc apples of France where he rose to prominence, and even a touch of sweetness with the Emperor's favourite palace dessert, royal pineapple. The heart features Napoleon roses, Louisiana birch which was used to construct his throne, jasmine from Egypt where he famously addressed his soldiers at the foot of the pyramids, exotic patchouli reportedly valued for scent and health. The base reveals oak moss from Spain, a late conquest of the Emperor, ambergris from the sea to allude to the strength of his navy, and again a gourmand note of vanilla in reference to the high living that Napoleon enjoyed. Okay, interesting stuff, isn't it? So yeah, I'd almost forgotten about this story, and I really like the idea that the bergamot comes from Italy, and that's one of the countries that he conquered. The idea of the birchwood being a throne that he had made from Louisiana birchwood. I really like all that stuff, that little story. So I think that's really interesting, and that idea that this is kind of a fragrance which encapsulates the idea of a successful, powerful man. I like that. It's a great smelling scent. I won't spend too long describing it, but it's fresh, but it's also a little bit complex. It's certainly got a really nice muskiness underneath it, a bit of a hint of classic old school perfumery to me. It kind of reminds me, not in the smell, but in the mood of a really easy reach, classy, fresh fragrance like Dior's Eau Sauvage or something like that. It has a little bit of that vibe, but it's different. The fruitiness from the blackcurrant is a nice twist, and it was unique at the time. Of course, the pineapple note is one of the most famous things we talk about. Actually, I think very few people, if they didn't know that note was listed, blind testing it, would pick out that there was a smell of pineapple, but perhaps it just gives a little edge of piquancy, a certain something to the sharp citrusness of the opening of this fragrance that made it, at least when it was first released, quite unique. So a good 9 out of 10 fragrance for me. Slightly now not such a huge favourite just because so many people have it. I know so many other people will have smelled it, and of course when you get into this hobby you search for things that are a little bit more interesting, different from where you started out, and maybe that you feel are new to your nose. And of course many people have now smelled this, and there are many clones of it, so we'll get onto those in just a second, but I still think it's really good. Don't forget, if you'd like to join the Smelly Army private members club over on Patreon, there's a link in the description to do that. It costs just $2 a month and you get an extra video from me every week, plus you get to watch everything I've already uploaded in there. We're building a really nice community, lots of interaction, and I'd love to see you in there. The other thing I can hardly avoid talking about, of course, is the issue of reformulation. So over 10 years, this one seems to be really picked up on by people as it's smelling different, maybe from batch to batch, year to year. Each batch has a little batch code. Mine is, and this one here is a 19S01, relatively recent. I've also got an old 15X01 batch, and they're pretty different in smell. That may be partly though because my old bottle of course has aged over time, have the citrus notes gone off, but some of the notes of course and the ingredients have been swapped around. Some things may have been banned, some people think they cut back on costs, maybe they decided to tone down the smoky birchwood note in the original fragrance a little bit, because maybe the consumers out there found that a bit too challenging, and freshness, simple things, you know, fruity fresh things maybe are more popular, so maybe that's why they've changed it. But I won't go into a whole thing about that. I think still the modern versions I've tried in store, and this one's a year or two old now, still really, really good, excellent fragrance, but not the most exciting thing in the world for me, because I have so many other fragrances and other types of stuff that I enjoy trying out. But let's look at some of the alternatives now. Okay, so the most famous cheap clone of this fragrance, of course, is this one here, Club de Nuit. Intense Man by the House of Armaf. So this one, I think it came out around about 2015, something like that, and you could buy it for sort of $20 or $25. It's now about £27 in the UK, or equivalent prices around the world. Some people say this has been reformulated. Apparently the one with the silver spray is better. Mine seems to be made in France. It's a recent bottle, and it's a really good alternative for the money, and a lot of people say they get great compliments with this one. People notice it. It has good performance. It doesn't have as a nice an opening by a long way really as the actual Creed Aventus. It's a little bit harsh. It has a kind of lemon pledge, or a rather simple, cheap, lemony citrus accord. Not really the nice pineapple thing. Not quite the same. I think there's a bit of jasmine in some note listings for Creed, and this doesn't have that sort of airy mid to the fragrance. It's a little bit less subtle. It's sort of a rustic version. If this is a rather good bottle of red wine, this is your cheap vin de table, but if it was served up with a nice pizza, I still wouldn't object to it, if you know what I mean. So it's a good fragrance, and people still get a lot of compliments. It performs well, and once it's kind of dried down on your skin, it is rather similar, not very, but you know, broadly pretty similar to Creed's Aventus, and a sort of rough and ready version that could be fun, and a lot of people do swear by this one, so perfectly fine to go for that. If you want to spend not much money, maybe I'd go for that option. Another good one though, usually a little bit more expensive now, is L'Aventure from the house of Al Haramain. Al Haramain L'Aventure came out at a similar time. To me, it gets much closer to the smell of my 2015 batch of Aventus. It's a really, really good fragrance. The opening, again, not quite there, not so harsh, but it just lacks a bit of the magic of the real thing. But the dry down, closer than is Club de Nuits to the real thing. Very, very good alternative if you want to spend roughly around the £40 mark or something like that. Still one of the inexpensive clones, not quite all there, but pretty good, and a fun presentation for sure on that one. Moving on then, of course I can't cover all the clones, there's so many. You can try things like Zara's Vibrant Leather, pretty decent, it'll do a good job. It's kind of fresh, doesn't have some of the base notes so much, but it's a good alternative. Mont Blanc Explorer, really popular one that just came out I think in 2019, or was it 18? Kind of in a similar ballpark to either of these two, probably a similar kind of price to the Al Haramain one, and so yeah, just a little bit different. Doesn't quite have some of the sort of smokiness and stuff, I think. A little bit more, maybe hints of Dior Sauvage undertones mixed in with the general sort of fresh opening accords of Aventus. Nowhere near quite as magical as the real thing, but a decent alternative. For me though, by the time I get to this and you're spending kind of designer prices, I'd rather have a bit more fun and go for something a little bit more off the, not on the radar of the average punter out in the street, but it's a decent alternative. So if we're going for sort of, let's say, higher end alternatives to Creed Aventus, of course there's a lot of those where you can spend a bit more money. Dua, of course, famous, one of the most famous clone houses, have numerous versions of Creed Aventus under the Poseidon name. We have Poseidon's Elixir originally. Now they have one called Poseidon's Elixir 11Z, which claims to clone the 11Z01 batch of Creed, which many say is one of the best. I can't say I've compared it. Very good quality, doesn't quite smell exactly the same as any of my batches of Aventus, maybe lacks a bit of magic in the opening, but it's got a really nice way of capturing the dry down of the Aventus, and it is more powerful. It's kind of a beast mode version. There's also one called Poseidon's Elixir Remixed Mod 3, where they put extra ambroxan. Again, even more performance and a really, really smooth and potent alternative. So there are other ones from Dua of clones of different things, or the ones where they've mixed it actually. Poseidon in the Caribbean, where they've crossed Aventus with Virgin Island Water by Creed, is absolutely brilliant, and I prefer that to the out-and-out Creed Aventus clones. Anyway, moving on. On the subject of the clone type fragrances then, if you really want to go for a fragrance that's not actually Creed Aventus, but you want to spend a bit more money, get something a bit more sort of fancy and exclusive, Pineapple Vintage products in general are excellent. So Pineapple Vintage, of course, came out back in 2016. They've done loads of versions of the fragrance. I've actually got the original, which had an accented pineapple accord. Okay, so this is the original, just Pineapple Vintage, not intense. And they had this photorealistic pineapple note that isn't in the actual Aventus, which was kind of fun. But it meant that the fragrance wasn't exactly the same as Aventus, but it's really good. A lot of people get compliments. Pineapple Vintage Intense, very similar, but just a bit stronger. Also really, really good. But for ones now that smell really, really close to the actual Creed Aventus, they've really upped their game. And there are two that are probably the front runners. The first one is Emperor, so it's Pineapple Vintage Emperor. And I think this is based on a particular year, sort of, I don't know, 2017 or 18, I'm not sure which year, but it's a really well balanced alternative to Aventus that captures the really beautiful opening. Never, nothing's quite exact, but it's pretty close to the opening notes of my 2015 batch, actually. I don't think it's meant to be based on that year, but it comes really close to that, and in the mid notes with the florals and the complexity and the juicy blackberry, blackcurrant stuff. You can also get an extract version, and these are a little bit more expensive. I can't remember the exact price, but sort of at the upper end of, or just above really, designer fragrance prices. But you're getting something kind of unique. The average person that you know who's not into fragrances won't have heard of it. Love the bottle design, and for me, this company offers the best Aventus clones. There's an extract version. This is the Eau de Parfum. Eau de Parfum's fine. The extract lasts a little bit longer, but this one very, very strong already. So I'd be happy to settle for that. And then they brought out one called Emperor Maximus. The bottle will look exactly the same. And that's a slightly different one. I think, let's get this right. Emperor Maximus, I believe, is a little tad bit more on the fresh side. So maybe if you just want a really well balanced, perfect rendition of Aventus from year whatever, Emperor or Emperor Extract, and Emperor Maximus, just a little bit more accent on the fresh notes, but still the base notes are really well captured in there. And I believe there's an extract version of that one if you want to pay a little bit more. So for me, these are the best high-end copies, if you like, of Aventus. They have better performance, I think I have to say, having tested, than my current batch of Aventus here. And they also capture have a little bit more oomph. This one is a little bit more on the fresh side still than either of the pineapple vintages, because that's the way real batches of the real thing have been going lately. So they lack a little bit of oomph. I won't go into that in detail, but you could argue that you're going to spend less and have a better fragrance with the pineapple vintages. I think there is a strong case for that. However, there are some nuances that are slightly different, and you could still prefer the real thing. So you pays your money, you takes your pick. This one, Brasilia Privé by Alexandria Fragrances, is also really good. I think it's based on a specific batch. Again, I can't comment on that, but it's a really, really nice, smooth, fruity, very, very wearable and nice performing fragrance. But there are so many, aren't they, guys? What else have we got? Let's have a look. There are cheapy ones, like Emperor Aftershave by Razor Rock. Has a little bit of a menthol thing, but if you like your aftershave splashes, that's like 10 or 12 pounds. Some of those can still be fun. Aldur Al Maknoun, anyone remember that one from Latafa? Not bad for like 10 or 12 pounds. Let's leave those aside and move on to alternative kind of things. Quick word on the famous flanker to Aventus, which is of course Aventus Cologne. This came out I think in 2018 or 19. I've got a sample here courtesy of Fragrance Samples UK. I actually bought this. I do recommend them as the best place to get fragrance samples if you are in the UK or Europe. So Aventus Cologne, a sort of slightly more fresh flanker to Aventus, captures a lot of the citrus and the musky feel of Aventus without the base notes. So if you found anything about Aventus a bit annoying, the patchouli note and that kind of stuff, the sort of slightly smoky undertone, that's removed, and you get a very, very nice, very wearable, crisp cologne. Only problem with that one, longevity and projection, not so great, and of course it's an expensive fragrance. Good solution to that is from the people at Pineapple Vintage, who of course are really focused on Aventus, so that's their speciality. So they tend to sometimes arguably do the best job with the clones, and they've got one called Emperor Cologne Intense, which basically smells extremely similar to the original Emperor Cologne. I do recommend this as a dumb reach, and I've actually got through a fair bit. I know that's not a huge dent, but for me, someone with a huge collection, that's quite a big dent in my bottle. And it's a really, really great dumb reach, super fresh and better performance than Aventus Cologne. And it doesn't just smell like Aventus because it's the Cologne version, so it's a little bit different. Not every other Tom, Dick and Sally will be wearing that one. Moving on to things by niche brands which smell a bit like Aventus and are quite good. Roger Parfums Elysium. This is the Parfum Cologne version of Elysium. Can we get that to focus? Perhaps not. Yes, we can. How exciting. So I just got a sample of that one because I personally don't find it worth buying a full bottle of. But I think arguably this one was the attempt by Roger Parfums, a very exclusive and expensive brand, to do a little bit of a take on Creed's Aventus. But it's different. It's certainly got a fresh zestiness that will remind many people of Aventus, and a muskiness underneath. A little bit more accent on the citrus, some qualities of its own, and it's very good. But if I'm going for a brand like Roger, which offers such a huge range and has a real exclusivity. You know, they're even aiming to be a bit more uber luxe than Creed. Why would I want to go for something where they've tried to go for a more mainstream smell and maybe been influenced by Creed? So it's a really good smell. Some people prefer it to Aventus, but for me it doesn't excite me so much. But you could consider that one. The best one for me, and you may not be surprised, it's Cedric Boise by Mancera. This came out not too long after Aventus, it's been out for ages. So Cedric Boise from Mancera. Superb performance on this fragrance. It has the citrusy opening. It also has, very importantly, the fruity blackcurrant feel of Aventus. It has a muskiness about it, and it has a lot of the vanilla, the sort of sweet undertone. It doesn't have any of the smokiness, and it has some characteristics, some sort of floral tones and hard to define things that are quite different to Aventus, but has a little bit of the same vibe. Many people talked about it as a clone when it first came out. I don't think it's a clone. It's a very good fragrance that was influenced by Aventus and accentuates the fruitiness and the citrus elements and has superb beast mode performance. I personally, and I may be a little bit in a minority here, I prefer it to Aventus or any of its clones, but if you actually really want that Aventus smell, this may not satisfy you. But I absolutely love Cedric Boise, and the price on that one way lower than Aventus, not much more if you shop around, than your designer fragrances. But of course it is a niche fragrance. So guys, that was my take on where we're at with the whole Aventus thing. 10 years, happy birthday, congratulations for Creed for creating one of the most influential men's fragrances of all time. Let me know what you thought about that in the comments below. I'll see you in the next video. Remember, whatever you're doing in life, let's project. Bye bye.